When a racist bank denied black veteran James Carter a loan, they thought they'd shut him out. Instead, they sparked a fire. James didn't just fight back. He bought the bank. This is the story of how one man turned rejection into triumph and changed an entire community. Before we begin, what's a memory from your childhood that always makes you smile? Let's hear your stories in the comments. James Carter stood tall, his shoulders broad and his posture upright, a soldier through and through. After more than a decade of service in the United States military, James had finally returned home. The medals on his chest spoke volumes about his bravery and commitment, but it was his heart that held the true story. He had served with honor, fought in foreign lands, and now all he wanted was to bring that same sense of duty and pride to his community. Home was a modest town, tucked away in the heart of America. It wasn't the grandest place, but to James, it was where his roots ran deep. This was the town that raised him, that saw him off to war, and this was the town he was determined to uplift. The years had been hard on the community. Factories had closed down, jobs had become scarce, and poverty loomed large over families who had once lived comfortably. But James had hope. He had a plan. In the years he spent away, James dreamed of starting his own business, a construction company that would not only rebuild the infrastructure of his town, but also offer employment to veterans and locals. James believed in his vision with an unwavering conviction. He had spent sleepless nights in war zones imagining what he could do back home, how he could use the skills and discipline he had learned in the military to give back. Now, he was ready. He had his family by his side, the most important pillar of support he could ask for. His wife, Angela, was everything to him. She was his rock, the person who had waited patiently while he served overseas, who wrote him letters of encouragement when times got tough, and who now stood beside him in this new chapter of their lives. Angela was sharp, resourceful, and always knew how to lift James's spirits when doubt crept in. Together, they were unstoppable. Their house, though modest, was filled with warmth. Pictures of their 2 young children lined the walls, children who James vowed to provide a better future for. The thought of his son and daughter growing up in a town with dwindling opportunities gnawed at him. He wasn't going to let that happen. This was about more than just a business. It was about creating a legacy, a beacon of hope for the next generation. Post-war America hadn't been kind to everyone, least of all to the African American community. James knew the challenges that lay ahead. The banks were notoriously difficult for black people to navigate, no matter their background or credentials. But he wasn't one to be discouraged easily. He believed in merit, in hard work. He thought that if anyone could break through the barriers, it would be him. After all, he had fought for his country. Now he was ready to fight for his dream. The town itself had changed over the years. What was once a bustling community had become quiet, almost desolate in parts. Boarded-up windows, shuttered stores, and empty streets told the story of a place in decline. But James saw potential. He saw the same streets he used to walk as a boy, now lined with the possibility of new life. He envisioned his construction company not only rebuilding homes and businesses, but also the spirit of the community itself. Angela was skeptical at first, not because she didn't believe in James. She did, wholeheartedly, but because she had seen the way the system worked. She had heard the stories of other black families, people they knew, who had tried to get loans from the banks only to be turned away. Sometimes it was an outright no, and other times it was a subtle, condescending denial hidden behind technicalities and excuses. But she saw the fire in James's eyes, and she couldn't bring herself to dampen his spirit. "Are you sure about this?" Angela asked one evening as they sat together on their worn-out sofa, their children already tucked into bed. James nodded, his eyes locked on hers. "I have to do this, Angela. For us, for the kids, for everyone here. I can't just sit back and watch this town die." She smiled softly, taking his hand in hers. "Then I'm with you, every step of the way." That was all James needed to hear. He spent the following months preparing meticulously for what was to come. Every evening after dinner, after the kids had gone to bed, he'd sit at the dining room table with his laptop open and books strewn around him. He drafted his business plan with precision, making sure every detail was covered. Market research, financial projections, staffing plans. He worked late into the night, determined to get it right. Angela helped where she could, reviewing documents and offering advice. She had a good head for numbers and an even better understanding of people. Together they were a team, a unit, just like James had been part of in the military. Every soldier needs a partner in the trenches, and Angela was that for him. It wasn't long before James had a solid plan in place. His construction business would focus on local projects, rebuilding homes, revitalizing commercial spaces, and eventually expanding to bigger contracts in neighboring cities. His goal wasn't just to make money, it was to give back, to create opportunities for others like him who had come back from serving their country, only to find there were no opportunities waiting for them. James took a deep breath one morning as he gathered his paperwork. It was time to approach the banks. He had heard about Hamilton National Bank, one of the most prestigious institutions in the area. They were known for being selective, but James believed that his military background, his solid business plan, and his dedication to his community would be enough to secure a loan. "Wish me luck," he said to Angela, kissing her on the cheek as he left the house. "You don't need luck," she replied with a smile. "You've got this." James walked out with his head held high, ready to take the first step toward turning his dream into reality. James Carter had always been a man of vision, and his dream of owning a construction business wasn't born overnight. During his years of service, as he traveled from one military base to another, from one conflict zone to the next, he had seen buildings destroyed, rebuilt, and communities rise from the ashes of war. It was during these times that the seed of his dream had been planted. James knew that one day he would come back home and build something that would last. He wasn't just building a business for himself. He was building a future for his family and his community. He wanted to create jobs for veterans, for people who had served their country and were struggling to find work. He wanted to hire locals who had watched their towns slowly decay over the years, people who were hungry for the chance to contribute to something meaningful again. James had seen firsthand how teamwork and discipline could achieve great things, and he was ready to apply that same mindset to his business. For months he worked tirelessly on his business plan, refining every detail. He didn't want to leave anything to chance. He studied the construction industry, analyzed the market, and assessed the needs of his town. The town's infrastructure was aging, and many buildings were in desperate need of repair. James saw potential everywhere he looked, potential for growth, for improvement, for renewal. He was convinced that with the right approach he could not only succeed but also help revitalize the town he loved. The business plan was airtight. James had mapped out every aspect of the venture, from the equipment he would need to the initial projects he would take on. He researched local suppliers, comparing prices and building relationships with those who could provide the materials he would need. His military background gave him an edge in planning. He was used to strategizing, to preparing for every possible scenario. And this time was no different. James knew he couldn't do it alone. He had a strong support system, starting with his wife, Angela. She had been there every step of the way, helping him with research, providing feedback, and most importantly, giving him the emotional strength he needed to push forward. Angela believed in him, and that belief was what kept him going on the toughest days. They talked for hours about the business, going over every detail, every possible challenge, and how they would overcome it together. Then there was Marcus, James's childhood friend. Marcus had stayed in the town while James went off to serve in the military, and he had seen firsthand the decline of their community. Marcus had always admired James's determination and drive, and when James shared his vision for the construction business, Marcus didn't hesitate to support him. Marcus was a local entrepreneur himself, running a small auto repair shop, and he knew how hard it could be to start a business from the ground up. But he also knew that if anyone could do it, it was James. "You've always been a man with a plan," Marcus had said one night over beers at James's kitchen table. "If anyone's going to turn this town around, it's you." James smiled, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with people like Marcus and Angela by his side, he felt ready to take on the challenge. The next step was funding. James had saved a modest amount during his years in the military, but it wasn't enough to cover the startup costs for the business. He needed a loan, a significant one, to get things off the ground. And that's where the banks came in. James spent weeks preparing his loan application. He gathered all the necessary documentation, his business plan, financial projections, market research, personal references, and everything else he thought would strengthen his case. He knew that banks could be tough on small business loans, especially for someone like him, a black man in America. But James had faith that his military service and the strength of his proposal would make the difference. He rehearsed his pitch over and over, making sure that every word was perfect. He wanted the bank to see that he wasn't just another applicant looking for money. He was a veteran, a community member, a leader. He had put in the work and he was ready to prove it. The night before his meeting with the bank, James sat at the table going over his documents one last time. Angela sat across from him, watching him with a mix of pride and concern. She knew how much this meant to him. She knew how hard he had worked for this moment. "Are you nervous?" she asked gently. "A little," James admitted, looking up from the stack of papers. "But I'm ready. I've done everything I can. Now it's in their hands." Angela smiled and reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You're going to do great. They'd be fools not to see what an incredible opportunity this is." James squeezed her hand, grateful for her support. He knew that whatever happened, Angela would be there, standing by his side. But deep down, he also knew that there was more at stake than just the loan. This was about proving that he could succeed despite the odds. This was about breaking through the barriers that had been set up against him and others like him. The next morning, James got dressed in his best suit, checked his documents one last time, and headed out the door. He was nervous, yes, but he was also determined. This was the moment he had been working toward for months. He was ready to make his dream a reality. As he drove to Hamilton National Bank, James couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. He had done everything right. Now it was time to see if the system would do right by him. James Carter stepped into the pristine lobby of Hamilton National Bank with a sense of purpose. The polished marble floors, the high ceilings, the quiet hum of business, it all exuded an air of success and opportunity. This was exactly the kind of institution he had envisioned as the perfect partner for his dream. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and now, with his well-researched business plan and perfectly organized documents, James felt ready. The bank's loan officer, Mr. Bradley, was a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair, dressed in a crisp suit that exuded the authority of his position. James had done his homework on Mr. Bradley. He was known to be meticulous, no-nonsense, and someone who prided himself on making sound financial decisions. That's exactly why James had chosen Hamilton National. He believed that merit would speak louder than anything else here. He believed that someone like Mr. Bradley would appreciate his careful planning, his military discipline, and his commitment to his business and community. As James sat across the desk from Mr. Bradley, he felt a surge of confidence. He had presented himself well, dressed in a sharp navy suit, with every detail of his presentation memorized and rehearsed. He had everything he needed to make a convincing case for why this loan was not just a good decision for him, but also a great investment for the bank. "Mr. Carter, let's go over your proposal," Mr. Bradley said, flipping through the documents James had provided. His voice was measured and professional, but there was an edge to it that James couldn't quite place. Still, he remained hopeful. James launched into his pitch with precision, outlining the business plan he had painstakingly crafted. He explained the demand for construction in the town, the potential for growth, and his vision of employing veterans and local workers. He highlighted his experience in the military, emphasizing the skills he had gained in leadership, logistics, and planning. He spoke with passion about his desire to contribute to the community, to rebuild the town that had fallen into disrepair. Mr. Bradley listened, occasionally nodding as he scanned through the paperwork. His expression remained neutral, giving James no real indication of how the meeting was going. James continued, determined to convey his sincerity and the strength of his plan. He knew he had done everything right. He knew that if anyone could secure this loan, it was him. Finally, Mr. Bradley looked up, his eyes meeting James's. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your service to our country," he began, his tone polite but distant. "And I can see you've put a lot of thought into this business plan. However, I'm afraid we can't approve your loan at this time." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had prepared himself for this possibility. After all, not every loan gets approved. But the way Mr. Bradley had phrased it, the casual dismissal, felt different. It didn't feel like a rejection based on numbers or risk assessments. There was something else lurking beneath the surface. James swallowed his disappointment and pressed on, trying to maintain his composure. "I'd like to understand, sir. I've provided all the necessary documentation, and I believe the business plan is solid. Can you explain what the issue is?" Mr. Bradley leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he regarded James with a patronizing smile. "Well, you see, Mr. Carter, there are certain risks that we have to consider. The market, for one, is rather volatile right now, and with your lack of experience in running a business of this scale, well, it's just not a risk we're comfortable taking." James blinked, stunned. "With all due respect, Mr. Bradley, I've outlined a clear plan for growth, and I've accounted for the market conditions in my projections. I'm also a decorated veteran, and I've led teams under extreme circumstances. I believe I'm more than qualified to manage this business." Mr. Bradley's smile faded slightly, replaced by a condescending look. "Military experience is commendable, Mr. Carter, but running a business in the civilian sector is a different ball game. The bank has to be cautious, especially with certain demographics." The implication in those last two words was unmistakable. James felt his heart race, his fists clenching under the table. He had known this could happen, Angela had warned him, but he had hoped that his qualifications, his service and his preparation would be enough to break through. Now here it was, laid bare before him. The subtle racism that had been lurking behind the polite facade. "Certain demographics?" James repeated, his voice tight. Mr. Bradley's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid there are just too many uncertainties in your case. I suggest you try a smaller bank, perhaps one that specializes in more tailored services." James stared at the man across the desk, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to push back, to demand that Mr. Bradley look at his plan again without the lens of prejudice. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made long before he stepped into the office. His skin color had spoken louder than his credentials ever could. Without another word, James stood, gathering his documents. He felt the weight of the rejection settle on his shoulders as he walked toward the door. Mr. Bradley watched him go, offering a curt, "Good luck, Mr. Carter." Outside the bank, the bright sun seemed to mock James as he stood on the steps, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disappointment. He had done everything right. He had served his country, prepared his business plan, and followed all the rules. But none of it mattered. Not here. Not in a system that was built to keep people like him out. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this defeat him. Couldn't let the racist systems win. But at that moment, as he walked away from the bank, he couldn't help but feel the sting of humiliation and the bitter taste of injustice. As he got into his car and drove away, his mind raced. He would have to explain this to Angela, to Marcus. He would have to figure out what to do next. But more than anything, he knew that this fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. James Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers in front of him. The business plan he had worked so hard on, the rejected loan application, and a list of other banks he had planned to approach. The silence of the house seemed to amplify the weight of the rejection he had faced earlier that day at Hamilton National Bank. His heart still pounded with frustration, and the knot in his stomach hadn't loosened since he walked out of Mr. Bradley's office. Angela sat across from him, her eyes filled with concern as she listened to him recount the humiliating meeting at the bank. She had been prepared for the possibility that James might be turned down, but hearing how it had happened, how the rejection was so clearly tied to his race, made her blood boil. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice tight with anger. "After everything you've done, everything you've worked for, they still treat you like this?" James sighed, rubbing his temples. "I thought if I had all the right pieces in place, it would be enough. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. I walked in there with a solid plan, a plan that any reasonable person would see is worth backing, and they just—" He shook his head, his frustration palpable. Angela reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "This isn't on you, James. This is their failure, not yours. They're too blind to see what you're capable of." James appreciated her words, but they did little to ease the sting of rejection. The truth was, he had known deep down that this might happen. Angela had warned him, and so had Marcus. They had both seen how the system worked, how doors were shut in the faces of people who didn't fit the mold of what the banks considered worthy. But James had thought that maybe, just maybe, his service to the country, his planning, and his dedication would be enough to break through those barriers. Now he realized how naive that hope had been. Over the next few days, James made appointments with several other banks, determined not to give up. He tried to push aside the memory of Mr. Bradley's patronizing smile, of the subtle but unmistakable racism that had colored the entire interaction. He told himself that there were other opportunities, other banks that might be willing to give him a fair shot. But as the meetings went on, it became clear that Mr. Bradley was not an anomaly. Each time James was met with the same condescending tone, the same vague excuses about risk and market conditions. It was as if they had all rehearsed the same lines, hiding their prejudice behind technical jargon. No matter how well prepared James was, no matter how thorough his business plan, the result was always the same. At one bank, the loan officer barely glanced at his paperwork before dismissing him. At another, the meeting lasted less than 10 minutes before James was politely shown the door. Each rejection chipped away at his optimism, each meeting a painful reminder that the system wasn't built for people like him. It wasn't about the strength of his plan or the potential of his business. It was about his skin color, plain and simple. After his 5th rejection, James sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as frustration and helplessness surged through him. It wasn't just the disappointment of not getting the loan. It was the realization that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he prepared, the deck was stacked against him from the start. Back at home, James found it increasingly difficult to keep his emotions in check. The financial strain was beginning to weigh heavily on him and Angela. They had been counting on getting a loan to kickstart the business, and with each rejection, their savings were dwindling. Every day, the dream felt more distant, more impossible. It wasn't just the financial blow that hurt. It was the emotional toll of knowing that the very system he had fought to protect as a soldier was now working against him. One evening, after another long day of fruitless meetings, James sat with Angela and Marcus at the kitchen table. He had invited Marcus over to talk things through, hoping that his friend might offer some advice or encouragement. "Man, I knew it would be tough," Marcus said, shaking his head. "But this is something else." "They won't even give me a chance," James said, his voice low with frustration. "It's like I'm invisible, or worse, like I don't belong. No matter what I do, it's never going to be enough." Angela looked at him with concern. "Maybe we should think about other options, James. Smaller banks, credit unions. There has to be someone out there who will see what we see." James nodded, though he felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. He had tried the smaller banks, and while they were less overt in their dismissal, the result had been the same. He wasn't just fighting for a loan. He was fighting against a system that was designed to keep people like him out. "I just don't know how much more of this I can take," James admitted quietly, leaning back in his chair. "I'm starting to think maybe this isn't going to happen." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You can't think like that, James. You're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for the whole community. If you give up, they win. They want you to walk away. They want you to feel like you don't deserve it. But you do. James nodded, appreciating his friend's words, though it was hard to shake the feeling of defeat that had settled over him. The weight of systemic racism was a burden he had been carrying his whole life, but this felt different. It was more personal, more direct, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting. As the weeks went by, the strain on James and Angela grew. They cut back on expenses, tightening their budget in every possible way. James tried to remain optimistic, but the constant rejections were taking their toll. He found himself avoiding conversations about the business, avoiding the hopeful looks Angela gave him, and avoiding the dreams he had once so passionately held. He spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. He had followed the rules, done everything right, and still, it wasn't enough. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly the way it was designed to. And that realization was perhaps the hardest pill to swallow. But as much as James wanted to give up, there was a part of him that refused to let go. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to walk away now. He just needed to find another way, another path forward. He wasn't sure what that path would be, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. The weeks dragged on, each one filled with the same frustrations and rejections that weighed heavily on James's shoulders. The constant strain had taken its toll, not just financially, but emotionally. He had been a man of resilience, shaped by years of military service, but this was different. This was a battle he hadn't been trained to fight, a battle against a faceless system that didn't care about his sacrifice, his skills, or his determination. One evening, after another long day of rejection, James found himself sitting alone in his living room. The house was quiet, the children asleep, and Angela was in the kitchen washing dishes in the stillness of the night. James stared blankly at the floor, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like never before. He had never felt so helpless, so powerless. He thought about giving up. Maybe the dream was just that, a dream. Maybe he wasn't meant to start his business, to build something lasting for his community. Maybe it was time to accept that no matter how hard he worked, some doors would always be closed to him. The thought of quitting gnawed at him, filling him with a deep sense of shame. He had never been a quitter. But now, for the first time in his life, the idea seemed appealing. It would be easier. It would be less painful. As the hours passed, James remained in that quiet space, wrestling with his thoughts. And then, as the night stretched on, something shifted inside him. A memory surfaced. Something from his days in the military. Something that had been buried beneath the weight of his current struggles. He remembered a particular mission, one that had seemed impossible at the time. His unit had been trapped behind enemy lines, outnumbered and outgunned, with no clear path to safety. They had been exhausted, demoralized, ready to give up. But James had refused to accept defeat. He had rallied his unit, drawing on the strength that came from somewhere deep within, a place he hadn't known existed until that moment. He had reminded his men of the importance of perseverance, of pushing forward even when every sign pointed to failure. And in the end, they had made it out. Against all odds, they had survived. The memory stirred something inside him, a flicker of the old James, the James who didn't back down, who didn't let obstacles stand in his way, the James who had led men into battle, who had faced down fear and uncertainty time and time again. He had survived worse than this. He had fought through harder battles, and if he had made it through those, he could make it through this. James sat up, his mind clearing as the memory continued to fuel his determination. He couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The system might be rigged against him, but that didn't mean he had to accept it. There had to be another way. There was always another way. The next day, with renewed energy, James began to dig deeper. He spent hours researching, looking for any crack in the system, any loophole, any opportunity that he could seize. He read articles, books, and reports on the financial system, on business ownership, and on how other black entrepreneurs had found success despite facing the same obstacles he was up against. The more he read, the more he began to understand that the problem wasn't just his. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of the financial industry. But James wasn't one to be intimidated by a system, no matter how large or powerful it seemed. He knew how systems worked. He had been part of one in the military. And just like in the military, he knew that systems could be navigated, even exploited, if you knew where to look. One evening, while reading a book on business acquisitions, James stumbled upon a concept that caught his attention. The author was discussing the idea of acquiring existing businesses instead of starting new ones, a strategy that allowed entrepreneurs to bypass many of the challenges associated with startups. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of trying to build something from the ground up, why not take control of something that was already established? A business that was struggling but had the potential to be turned around. James sat back in his chair, the wheels in his mind turning. Could this be the solution he had been looking for? Instead of trying to get a loan to start his own construction company, could he buy an existing business? And not just any business. What if he could buy a bank? The idea was bold, audacious even. But as James thought about it, he realized it wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. He had spent months trying to secure a loan from these institutions, only to be shut out at every turn. But what if he flipped the script? What if, instead of asking for their approval, he took control of the very system that had rejected him? His heart raced at the thought. It was an ambitious plan, one that would require an entirely new strategy and a lot of research. But the more James thought about it, the more it made sense. He had the leadership skills, the discipline, and the vision. What he needed now was the knowledge, and maybe a little help. That night, James barely slept. His mind was alive with possibilities, his energy renewed by this new idea. He stayed up late, scribbling down notes, mapping out the steps he would need to take to make this bold move a reality. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and a lot of work. But James was no stranger to hard work. He had built his life on it. The next morning, as the sun rose, James was already back at his desk, poring over financial documents, reading everything he could about how banks operated, how businesses were acquired, and what it would take to pull off something like this. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He would need to build a team, find allies who believed in his vision and were willing to take the risk with him. Angela, always by his side, saw the change in James. The despair that had weighed him down was gone, replaced by the fierce determination she knew so well. When he shared his idea with her, she listened carefully, nodding as he laid out the plan. It was ambitious, no doubt about it, but if anyone could make it happen, it was James. "You've never been one to think small," she said with a smile. "If this is what you want to do, I'm with you all the way." James smiled back, feeling the warmth of her support. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, his community, and proving to himself and everyone else that he could break through the barriers that had been placed in his way. He would buy that bank. He would turn the system on its head. And when he did, the people who had doubted him, who had shut the door in his face, would regret it. But more importantly, James knew that this wasn't just about proving a point. It was about creating real change, about making sure that others like him wouldn't have to face the same obstacles. He was going to build something lasting, something that would make a difference for generations to come. And nothing was going to stop him. James Carter sat in his study, surrounded by books, notes, and his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his face as the hours stretched deep into the night. The excitement of his new plan had consumed him, driving him forward with an intensity he hadn't felt in weeks. He had moved past the rejections, the frustration, and the despair. Now, it was all about strategy, about creating a path to take control of the very system that had tried to keep him out. The first step in his new journey was clear. He needed a team. James knew from his time in the military that no mission could be accomplished alone. He had always relied on the strength of his comrades, and this mission would be no different. He needed people who believed in his vision, who understood the challenges they were up against, and who could help him navigate the complex world of business acquisitions. His first call was to Marcus. If anyone could understand the struggles James had faced and the importance of what he was trying to achieve, it was his lifelong friend. Marcus had been there from the beginning, supporting him when the rejections came in, always encouraging him to keep going. More importantly, Marcus had experience as an entrepreneur. Though his auto repair shop was small, it had survived in an economy that had crushed many others. Marcus knew how to navigate tough times, and his business acumen would be invaluable in the months ahead. James picked up the phone, dialing Marcus's number. It rang twice before his friend answered. "James, what's up, man? How's everything going?" Marcus asked, his tone as upbeat as ever. "I've got an idea and I need you to hear me out," James replied, getting straight to the point. "I'm done trying to get loans from these banks. They're not going to give me a chance no matter how good my business plan is. So I'm thinking, what if I stop asking for a loan and start looking to buy a bank instead?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching for a moment before Marcus responded. "Wait, buy a bank? Are you serious?" "Dead serious," James said, his voice steady with conviction. "I've been doing the research and I think it's possible. It's going to take time and I'm going to need help, but I think this could be the answer. If we own the bank, we can set the rules. We can make sure people like us have access to the resources we need to build our businesses and our communities." Marcus was silent again, but James could tell his friend was thinking. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Man, that's bold, really bold. But you know what? It sounds like the kind of thing only you would come up with, and I like it. You're right, we've been asking them for permission for too long. Maybe it's time we took control." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Marcus was on board. "I knew you'd get it," James said, smiling. "I've already started putting together a plan. I'm going to need you to help with the financials, and I need someone I can trust to keep me grounded." "You know I've got your back, James," Marcus replied. "Whatever you need, I'm in. Let's do this." With Marcus on board, James knew the next step was to find someone who had experience in the banking industry. He needed someone who could help him understand the intricacies of banking regulations, acquisitions, and operations. That's where Mr. Thompson came in. Mr. Thompson was a retired banker, a man who had spent decades working in the industry before leaving it behind to run a small financial consultancy. James had met him a few years back at a veterans business networking event, where Mr. Thompson had spoken about the challenges of securing financing for minority-owned businesses. His words had resonated with James at the time, but now they felt even more relevant. James knew that if anyone could help him navigate the complexities of buying a bank, it was Mr. Thompson. He picked up the phone again, dialing the number he had kept from that networking event. "Hello?" Mr. Thompson's voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that immediately commanded respect. "Mr. Thompson, it's James Carter. We met a while back at a veterans business event. I'm not sure if you remember me." "Of course I remember you, James," Mr. Thompson interrupted with a warm chuckle. "You were the young man with big dreams of starting a construction business. How's that going for you?" James smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Well, that's actually why I'm calling. The short version is, it's not going well. The banks won't even look at my loan application, so I'm thinking about taking a different approach. I want to buy a bank, and I could really use your guidance." There was a pause, and James could almost hear Mr. Thompson weighing the idea. When he finally spoke, his tone was curious but cautious. "Buying a bank is no small feat, James. It's a complex process. There are regulations, legal hurdles, and financial risks. But it's not impossible. If you're serious about this, I'd be happy to help. I've been out of the game for a while, but I still know my way around the industry." "I'm dead serious," James said, his voice firm. "I've done my research, and I know it's going to be tough. But I believe this is the way to make real change. Not just for me, but for people like us who've been shut out for too long." "Good," Mr. Thompson said after a moment. because if you're going to pull this off, you're going to need to be fully committed. I'll help you with the technical side, understanding how to evaluate the banks that are up for sale, how to navigate the regulatory requirements, and how to build a business plan that investors will take seriously. James felt a surge of excitement. He had the beginnings of a real team now. With Marcus handling the financials and Mr. Thompson guiding him through the intricacies of the banking industry, his plan was starting to take shape. But there was one more person who needed to be fully on board: Angela. Angela had been his greatest supporter from day one, but this was a huge leap. A leap that would affect their finances, their family, and their future in ways they hadn't imagined. James knew he couldn't move forward without her being fully committed to the plan. That evening, after the kids were in bed, James sat down with Angela at the kitchen table, just like they had done so many times before. He explained the entire plan to her in detail: how he wanted to stop asking for loans and start looking to buy a bank, how Marcus and Mr. Thompson were on board, and what it would mean for their family. Angela listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. When James finished, she sat back, letting out a long breath. "Wow, James, this is big. Like really big." "I know," James said, his voice soft. "And I know it's a lot to take in. But I really believe this is the way forward. I've hit a wall with the banks, and this is the only way I can see to get past it. We'll have to make sacrifices, and it won't be easy. But I need to do this." Angela was silent for a moment. Then she looked at him with that same determination she had always shown. "James, if this is what you believe in, then I'm with you all the way. We'll figure it out together, like we always do." James reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the weight of her support settle around him like armor. With Marcus, Mr. Thompson, and Angela by his side, he knew that the next steps, though difficult, were possible. Now it was time to start planning the acquisition. The real work was about to begin. As James Carter continued his research and planning, his sights were set on finding a bank to acquire. It wasn't just about buying any bank. It had to be the right bank, one that was struggling and vulnerable enough to be taken over, but with enough potential to be turned around with the right leadership. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that his persistence and careful strategy could uncover the opportunity he needed. That's when he stumbled upon the situation at Hamilton National Bank, the same bank that had denied him a loan, the same bank where Mr. Bradley had looked him in the eye and subtly reminded him that the system wasn't built for people like him. The irony wasn't lost on James, and the more he looked into the bank's financial situation, the more he realized just how precarious things had become for them. Hamilton National Bank had been a pillar in the community for decades, known for its exclusivity and reputation for serving the wealthiest clients in the region. But in recent years, the bank had started to falter. Poor management, outdated business practices, and a growing disconnect with the needs of the modern financial landscape had left Hamilton National vulnerable. The financial crisis had hit hard, and the bank's leadership had failed to adapt. Their customer base had dwindled, and competitors had started to gain ground, offering more innovative services and better rates. James learned that, in particular, their focus on serving only high-net-worth individuals had backfired. As the local economy struggled, the bank had refused to adapt to the needs of the broader community, alienating small business owners, entrepreneurs, and working-class families, exactly the people James wanted to help. The arrogance of the bank's leadership, their belief that they were too established to fail, had put them in a precarious position. James studied the bank's public financial reports, looking for cracks in their armor. Their profits had been steadily declining for the past few years, and their stock price had taken a hit. There were rumors circulating in the financial community about internal strife and disagreements among the board of directors about the future direction of the bank. All of this pointed to one conclusion: Hamilton National was ripe for a takeover. Sitting at his desk late one night, James ran the numbers again. The bank wasn't a giant, but it was big enough to make a significant impact on the community if it was managed properly. More importantly, it was weak enough for someone like him, with the right backing and strategy, to acquire it. The idea of taking over the very institution that had shut him out was almost poetic. This wasn't just business, it was justice. James knew, however, that making a move on Hamilton National wasn't going to be simple. He needed to be strategic, and he needed to build a case that would convince investors to back him. This was where Mr. Thompson's expertise would come into play. With decades of experience in banking, Mr. Thompson had seen takeovers like this before, and he knew exactly how to approach it. The next day, James met with Mr. Thompson in his small office. The room smelled of old leather and wood polish, and the walls were lined with books on finance, banking law, and the history of the American economy. Mr. Thompson sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes focused on the documents James had laid out in front of him. "Hamilton National," Mr. Thompson murmured, flipping through the financial reports James had compiled. Well, I have to admit this is a bold move. They've been in trouble for a while now, but most people wouldn't think they're vulnerable enough for a buyout. They've been good at keeping their troubles under wraps." James nodded. "Exactly. On the surface, they're still holding on to their reputation. But if you look deeper, you'll see how bad things really are. They've lost touch with the community, and their management is out of sync with the modern banking environment. I think we could make a move." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's certainly possible, but it's not just about finding a struggling bank. It's about making sure you have the right resources in place to turn it around once you acquire it. Investors will want to know you have a clear plan for how to restructure the bank and make it profitable again." James smiled. "That's where Marcus comes in. He's been working on the financials with me. We've already started building a business plan that focuses on revitalizing the bank by offering services to the people Hamilton National has ignored for years. Small business owners, entrepreneurs, veterans, minority-owned businesses. There's a huge underserved market that we can tap into." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. And how do you plan to get the capital for the acquisition?" "You're going to need more than just a solid plan. You're going to need significant financial backing." "I've been reaching out to investors," James replied. "I've already got a few interested, especially in the idea of owning a bank that's community-focused. With the right pitch, I think I can bring in more. I'm also talking to some veteran-owned investment firms. They're excited about the idea of a veteran taking over a bank and making real changes." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "You've done your homework, James. This is no small task, but I think you've got a shot. Hamilton National is vulnerable, and if you can get the right investors on board, you just might pull this off." James felt a surge of excitement. Hearing Mr. Thompson's validation made the plan feel even more real. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared for the challenge. This wasn't just about business. It was about proving that he could succeed in a system designed to keep people like him out. It was about creating opportunities for his community and showing the world that Black veterans, entrepreneurs, and everyday people could thrive if given the chance. Over the next few weeks, James and his team worked tirelessly to refine their strategy. With Mr. Thompson's guidance, they drafted a proposal for the acquisition, focusing on how they would restructure the bank, attract new customers, and restore profitability. Marcus handled the financial projections, ensuring that every aspect of the plan was backed by solid numbers. The more they worked, the more confident James became. He could see it now. Carter Community Bank, a place where people who had been shut out by the system could finally get a fair shot. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming a reality. And soon, Hamilton National's board of directors would realize just how vulnerable they were. James knew he was on the verge of something big. And when the time came, he would be ready to strike. Months of preparation, late nights, and endless strategy meetings had all led to this moment. James Carter stood outside the glass doors of Hamilton National Bank, the same bank where he had once been denied a loan. Today, he wasn't there to request approval or present a business plan for someone else's benefit. Today, he was there to take over. The journey to this point had been anything but easy. James had spent months refining his proposal, gathering investors and studying the banking industry with relentless focus. Mr. Thompson had been by his side every step of the way, guiding him through the complexities of the acquisition process. Together with Marcus, who had helped craft the financial plan, they had built a solid case for why Hamilton National was vulnerable to a buyout and why James Carter was the one to turn it around. The day the official negotiations began, James had walked into the boardroom with his head held high, surrounded by his team of advisors. The board of directors at Hamilton National had been caught off guard when they first received his proposal. They had known for some time that their bank was in trouble, but they hadn't expected someone like James to make a move. Mr. Bradley, the same man who had dismissed James during his loan application, was among the members of the board. As James entered the room, he could feel Bradley's eyes on him. The shock on Bradley's face was unmistakable when he realized that James wasn't just another applicant. He was a serious contender, ready to buy the very bank that had once rejected him. The negotiations had been tense at first. Hamilton National's board members, while desperate for a solution to their financial problems, were wary of selling the bank to someone outside their established network. They questioned James's experience, his ability to manage a financial institution, and whether he had the resources to pull off such a monumental task. But James had come prepared. He answered every question with precision, laying out his vision for the bank's future and the team he had assembled to ensure its success. As the discussions continued, James presented the board with the undeniable facts. Hamilton National was sinking, and without new leadership and direction, it would only be a matter of time before the bank collapsed entirely. He explained how his experience in the military had taught him the importance of discipline, strategy, and leadership, skills that would translate directly into managing the bank's operations. He highlighted the financial projections Marcus had worked tirelessly on, showing how his new approach to community banking would not only save the bank, but also make it profitable once again. The turning point came when James introduced his plan to refocus the bank's efforts on serving the community, the very community Hamilton National had neglected for so long. He spoke passionately about offering fair loans to small business owners, veterans, and minority entrepreneurs who had been shut out of the system for years. He painted a picture of a bank that didn't just serve the wealthy elite, but helped build the future of the community as a whole. It was a vision that resonated with some of the board members, who had seen the bank's reputation suffer under its outdated practices. And then there was the offer. James had secured enough financial backing from his investors to make a competitive bid, one that Hamilton National couldn't afford to turn down. His team had put together a financing package that would pay off the bank's debts, cover the cost of the acquisition, and provide enough capital to implement his new business strategy. The numbers were solid and the board members knew it. By the time the negotiations concluded, there was little doubt left in the room. Hamilton National Bank was no longer in a position to dictate terms. They needed James more than he needed them. The board voted, and with a mixture of resignation and relief, they accepted his offer. James Carter was about to become the owner of Hamilton National Bank. The day the papers were signed, James felt a mixture of triumph and disbelief. It had happened. The very institution that had once looked down on him, that had rejected him because of the color of his skin, was now under his control. It was more than just a business deal. It was a moment of redemption, a moment that proved to himself and everyone else that he was capable of beating a system designed to exclude him. But there was still one more thing James had to do. As he walked through the familiar halls of the bank after the acquisition was finalized, he made his way to Mr. Bradley's office. The same office where he had once sat, humiliated and frustrated, as his loan application was dismissed with thinly veiled prejudice. Today, the tables had turned. James knocked on the door and stepped inside. Mr. Bradley sat behind his desk, his face pale as he looked up at the man who now owned the bank. There was no more smugness in his expression, no condescension. He knew exactly what was happening. "Mr. Carter," Bradley said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I didn't expect to see you here." James didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'm sure you didn't," he replied, his voice calm but firm. But I wanted to make something clear. The days of people like you deciding who gets to succeed and who doesn't, they're over." Bradley swallowed hard, his discomfort obvious. He shifted in his seat, unsure of what to say. James continued, "I'm taking this bank in a new direction. We're going to serve the people this institution has ignored for far too long. And that means there's no place for you here anymore." The silence in the room was heavy as the words sank in. Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but James cut him off. "You had your chance to make a difference, and you chose to stand in the way of progress. I won't make that same mistake." With that, James turned and walked out of the office, leaving Bradley behind. There was no need for further discussion. The message had been delivered. The following week, Hamilton National Bank officially reopened under a new name, Carter Community Bank. The grand reopening was a celebration unlike anything the community had seen in years. Local business owners, veterans, and families gathered outside the bank to witness the transformation. The bank, once a symbol of exclusion and elitism, had been reborn as a place of opportunity and inclusion. James stood on the steps of the bank, addressing the crowd with a sense of pride and purpose. He spoke about the future, about how Carter Community Bank would be different, how it would offer fair loans, support small businesses, and provide financial education to those who had been left behind. His words resonated with the crowd, and as they cheered, James knew that this was just the beginning. Carter Community Bank wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up, when they fought against the odds and took control of their destiny. It was proof that even in a system built to exclude, change was possible. As the celebration continued, James looked out at the people he had fought so hard to help. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs too. And as Carter Community Bank began its new chapter, James knew that the best was yet to come. The transformation of Hamilton National Bank into Carter Community Bank was more than a change in name. It marked a fundamental shift in the way the bank operated and how it was perceived by the community. Under James Carter's leadership, the institution underwent a sweeping overhaul, one that reflected his vision of what a bank should truly be. A place of opportunity, inclusion, and empowerment for those who had been systematically excluded from the financial system for far too long. From the very beginning, James made it clear that Carter Community Bank would prioritize serving the people who had been ignored for decades. Minority business owners, veterans, working-class families, and aspiring entrepreneurs who had been denied loans and financial support because they didn't fit the traditional mold of the bank's clientele. His goal wasn't just to save the bank from financial ruin, but to fundamentally change its role in the community. One of James's first major decisions as the new owner was to implement fair lending policies that would give people like him, the very people the old Hamilton National had rejected, a real chance to succeed. He brought in a team of experts, many of whom were veterans and minority professionals with deep ties to the community, to help restructure the bank's loan approval process. They developed new criteria that focused on the potential of the applicants and their dedication to their businesses, rather than just their credit history or existing assets. The change was immediate and noticeable. For the first time, local business owners who had been struggling to find financing were able to secure loans to expand their operations. Entrepreneurs with innovative ideas but limited resources were finally given the financial backing they needed to bring their dreams to life. The bank became a lifeline for those who had been overlooked, offering not just loans, but also financial education programs to help people manage their money, build their credit, and grow their businesses. James made sure that the bank was deeply integrated into the community. He organized workshops on financial literacy, helping people understand how to navigate the banking system and make informed decisions about their financial futures. These workshops were free and open to everyone, and they quickly became popular, drawing in people from all walks of life who were eager to learn how to take control of their finances. At the heart of the bank's transformation was James's commitment to veterans. As a veteran himself, He knew the unique challenges that men and women who had served their country faced when they returned to civilian life. Too often, veterans were unable to secure loans or jobs, despite their skills and experience, and many ended up struggling to make ends meet. Carter Community Bank changed that. James launched a On Veterans Loan program, offering low-interest loans and specialized financial services to veterans looking to start businesses, buy homes, or pursue higher education. He also partnered with local veterans organizations to provide career counseling and job placement services. The community responded to these changes with overwhelming support. Word quickly spread that Carter Community Bank wasn't just another institution concerned with profits, but a place that truly cared about the people it served. Local businesses that had once struggled to stay afloat now thrived, thanks to the bank's support. Entrepreneurs who had been denied opportunities by larger, more traditional banks found a home at Carter Community Bank, where their ideas were taken seriously and their potential was recognized. James also made a point of hiring locally. He knew that for the bank to be successful, it had to reflect the community it served. He brought in local talent, people who knew the town, understood its struggles, and were invested in its future. This created a sense of pride and ownership among the employees, who felt they were part of something bigger than just a job. They were helping to rebuild their community from the inside out. The bank's headquarters, once a symbol of exclusion and elitism, was transformed into a welcoming space where people felt comfortable walking through the doors, whether they were there to open an account, apply for a loan, or attend a financial literacy workshop. The cold, formal atmosphere of Hamilton National was replaced with warmth and openness. James made sure that every employee was trained to treat customers with respect and empathy, regardless of their background or financial situation. He believed that everyone who walked through the doors of Carter Community Bank deserved to be treated like they mattered, because they did. James's leadership was not without its challenges. The larger banks in the region, who had long dominated the financial landscape, viewed Carter Community Bank as a threat. They couldn't ignore the growing influence of this upstart institution, which was attracting customers they had taken for granted for years. Some of these larger banks tried to discredit James and his vision, questioning whether his approach was sustainable or whether a small community bank could compete in a world of corporate giants. But James didn't let the criticism slow him down. He knew that Carter Community Bank wasn't just about making a profit. It was about making a difference. And the more the bank succeeded, the more the community rallied behind it. Customers who had once felt disconnected from the banking system now felt like they were part of something bigger. They weren't just clients. They were partners in the bank's mission to create real change. One of the most powerful moments came during a community celebration. Marking the first anniversary of Carter Community Bank's reopening, James stood in front of a crowd of local business owners, veterans, families, and community leaders who had gathered to celebrate the bank's success. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. "This bank isn't just mine," James said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "It belongs to all of you. We built this together, and we're going to keep building it for future generations. This is only the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, and James knew that Carter Community Bank had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up, when they pushed past the barriers and created a future that was fair and just for everyone. As the community event continued, James couldn't help but think about how far they had come. Hamilton National Bank was no longer a place of exclusion. It had been reborn as a bank that truly represented the people it served. And James was determined to ensure that it stayed that way for years to come. As Carter Community Bank flourished, it quickly became a beacon of hope in the town, a symbol of what could be achieved through determination and perseverance. The success stories of small business owners, veterans, and families who had benefited from the bank's fair lending practices spread beyond the community. James Carter's name began to circulate in financial circles, and Carter Community Bank gained recognition as a model for what community banking should be. However, Success brought with it new challenges. James had known from the start that the larger banks wouldn't be pleased with the changes he was making. His approach was radically different from the conservative, profit-driven mindset that dominated the industry. While the bigger banks focused on serving only high-net-worth clients, Carter Community Bank had carved out a niche by prioritizing community service and inclusion. This difference in philosophy didn't sit well with the major players in the region, and soon, James began to feel the weight of their discontent. It started with legal battles. The larger banks in the area, threatened by Carter Community Bank's growing influence, began to explore ways to undermine James and his leadership. They filed complaints with banking regulators, accusing the bank of reckless lending practices, claiming that James was approving too many loans to individuals and businesses with low credit scores. These accusations were thinly veiled attempts to discredit the bank's mission, but they were serious enough to warrant investigations. James spent countless hours meeting with his legal team, poring over documents and preparing for hearings. The accusations were baseless, but they were a distraction, one that threatened to drain the bank's resources and slow down its momentum. Every time a complaint was filed, it forced James to divert his attention away from the bank's core mission of serving the community, and instead focus on defending the institution he had worked so hard to build. The legal challenges were accompanied by smear campaigns in the press. Some of the larger banks had close ties to the media, and they used those connections to spread negative stories about Carter Community Bank. Articles were published questioning the sustainability of the bank's lending practices, suggesting that James was risking the financial health of the bank by approving loans that other banks wouldn't touch. Headlines implied that the bank was on the verge of collapse, stirring doubt in the minds of customers and investors alike. James was no stranger to adversity, but the constant attacks began to wear on him. He had expected pushback, but he hadn't anticipated just how far the established financial institutions would go to protect their turf. It was clear that they saw him as a threat, not just because of his success, but because of what he represented. Carter Community Bank was living proof that a different way of banking was possible, one that put people over profits, and that was something the larger banks couldn't afford to let succeed. Through it all, James kept his focus on the community. He knew that the best way to respond to the attacks was to keep delivering on the promises he had made. As long as Carter Community Bank continued to serve its customers with fairness and integrity, the smear campaigns and legal challenges would eventually lose their power. But the pressure was immense, and it wasn't just affecting James professionally, it was taking a toll on his personal life as well. Angela, who had been his rock throughout the entire process, could see the strain in her husband's eyes. He was spending more and more time at the office, often working late into the night to stay ahead of the legal battles and negative press. Their conversations, once filled with excitement and optimism about the future of the bank, had become dominated by discussions of lawsuits, complaints, and strategies for handling the growing opposition. One evening, as they sat together in their living room after putting the kids to bed, Angela finally spoke up. "James, you can't keep doing this to yourself," she said gently, her eyes filled with concern. "I know how much this bank means to you, but you're running yourself into the ground. You need to take a step back, even if it's just for a little while." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right, but the idea of stepping back, even for a moment, felt impossible. The bank was under constant attack, and every day brought new challenges. If he let up, even for a second, he feared that everything he had built would start to crumble. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly. "There's so much at stake, Angela. If I don't stay on top of this, they're going to destroy everything we've worked for." Angela reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not in this alone, James. You have a team, people who believe in you and in what this bank stands for. Let them help. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself." Her words stayed with him, and over the next few days, James began to delegate more responsibilities to his team. Marcus took on a larger role in managing the bank's day-to-day operations, while Mr. Thompson helped navigate the legal challenges. The burden began to lighten, and for the first time in months, James allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But even as he stepped back, the conflict continued to escalate. The larger banks, frustrated that their legal and media strategies hadn't taken down Carter Community Bank, began to apply economic pressure. They cut off partnerships with suppliers who worked with the bank, pressured businesses to take their accounts elsewhere, and even offered predatory rates to customers who were considering moving their money to Carter Community Bank. James knew that this was the most dangerous threat yet. The larger banks had resources that Carter Community Bank simply couldn't match. If enough customers were scared off, if enough business partnerships were broken, the bank's financial health would be in serious jeopardy. But just when it seemed like the pressure might be too much, something extraordinary happened. The community rallied. Small business owners, veterans, families, and even people from neighboring towns began to speak out in support of Carter Community Bank. Social media campaigns were launched, with customers sharing their positive experiences with the bank and encouraging others to do the same. Local news outlets, tired of the corporate-driven smear campaign, began publishing stories about the bank's impact on the community, highlighting the success stories of people whose lives had been transformed by James's leadership. James had built the bank to serve the community, and now the community was coming to its defense. It was a powerful reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. The larger banks might have more money, more influence, and more connections, but Carter Community Bank had something far more valuable: the trust and loyalty of the people it served. With the community behind him, James knew that Carter Community Bank would survive this storm. The conflict had been draining, but it had also revealed just how much power there was in unity. This wasn't just a fight for the bank's survival, it was a fight for the future of the community itself, and together they would prevail. The challenges that had threatened Carter Community Bank only seemed to strengthen James Carter's resolve. He was no stranger to adversity, and this wasn't the first time he had faced a system built to break him. But now, something was different. The community was standing behind him. Their support was his lifeline, fueling his determination to not only survive the onslaught but to emerge stronger than ever. James realized that fighting back wasn't just about keeping the bank afloat. It was about defending the community's right to prosper. He gathered his team, including Marcus, Mr. Thompson, and other trusted advisors, for a series of strategic meetings. The larger banks may have had deep pockets, but they didn't have the trust and loyalty of the people. That was where James's strength lay, and he knew it was time to leverage it to its fullest potential. The first step was fighting back legally. Mr. Thompson, along with a seasoned team of lawyers, dug into the accusations and lawsuits filed by rival banks. They countered every claim with precision, exposing the baselessness of the charges. It became clear that the legal battles were nothing more than attempts to slow down Carter Community Bank's growth. The community watched closely as the cases were systematically dismantled one by one, showing that James had done nothing but operate with integrity. Simultaneously, James ramped up community outreach efforts. He organized public forums and town hall meetings, where he explained the bank's mission and answered questions from concerned customers. He wanted to be as transparent as possible. These meetings were a hit, allowing people to feel more connected to the bank than ever before. Customers appreciated the honesty and the personal touch, and they began to feel a sense of ownership in Carter Community Bank's success. The most significant change came when James doubled down on the bank's commitment to supporting local businesses and entrepreneurs. He launched a new program offering microloans to startups and small businesses, with special consideration given to minority-owned and women-owned ventures. This program was a direct response to the community's needs, helping to foster innovation and growth where it was needed most. At the same time, James expanded the BAS Veterans Loan Program, providing not only financial support, but also mentorship opportunities for veterans who wanted to start their own businesses. He partnered with established business leaders to create a network where these veterans could receive guidance, training, and the resources needed to succeed. The ripple effect of these programs was extraordinary. Within months, several small businesses that had received loans from Carter Community Bank began to flourish. Local shops, restaurants, and service providers saw an increase in sales and customer traffic, leading to job creation and economic revitalization across the community. People who had once been unemployed or underemployed now had stable, well-paying jobs. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was cultural. People began to believe in their town's future again. Despite the success, the Sashi pushback from larger bank size continued. They increased their economic pressure, offering new customers bonuses and incentives to open accounts with them instead of Carter Community Bank. They tried to lure away James' clients with promises of better interest rates and perks. But something remarkable happened. The community didn't budge. Customers who had been with Carter Community Bank stayed loyal, and new customers flocked to the bank, eager to be part of something that felt more personal and meaningful than the sterile, corporate-driven experiences offered by the bigger banks. James watched in awe as the community continued to rally. The smear campaigns began to fall apart as customers shared their positive experiences online, and local news outlets published stories about the bank's ongoing success. The tide was turning, and James knew that Carter Community Bank had weathered the storm. But it wasn't just about surviving, it was about creating a lasting impact. James knew that if the bank was to continue thriving in the long term, it needed to become more than just a local success story. He began to think about legacy, what kind of institution he wanted Carter Community Bank to be, not just for the next few years, but for the next few decades. To cement the bank's place in the financial world, James started a mentorship program for aspiring bankers and entrepreneurs from underserved communities. He believed that the best way to ensure the bank's future was to invest in the next generation of leaders. Through partnerships with local schools and colleges, the program provided students with internships, scholarships, and hands-on experience in finance. The goal was simple: to create a pipeline of talent that would eventually lead to more diverse, inclusive leadership in the banking industry. James also began giving motivational talks at business conferences and community events, sharing his story of perseverance and the journey of transforming Carter Community Bank. His speeches resonated with audiences far and wide, and he quickly became a sought-after speaker, known for his passion, resilience, and commitment to uplifting others. As Carter Community Bank continued to grow, James reflected on how far they had come. What had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge had become a symbol of what was possible when a community came together with a shared vision. The bank was thriving, and so was the town. People were finding new opportunities, starting businesses, and rebuilding their lives. But for James, it wasn't just about the present. It was about ensuring that Carter Community Bank remained a force for good long after he was gone. He knew that his legacy would be defined not only by what he had built, but by the lasting change he had inspired. The day Carter Community Bank marked its 5th anniversary, James stood outside the bank's headquarters, looking up at the building that had once been Hamilton National. The sun was shining brightly, and the town was bustling with life. New businesses, families, and opportunities filled the streets. It was a far cry from the struggling community it had been just a few years ago. And James knew that this was just the beginning. The bank had become a cornerstone of the town's success, but more than that, it had become a symbol of what could be achieved when someone refused to accept the limits placed on them. James had defied the odds, broken through barriers, and created something lasting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told that they didn't belong, that they weren't good enough. As he walked through the front doors of Carter Community Bank that morning, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the day he was denied a loan by Mr. Bradley to the moment he signed the papers to buy the bank, every step had been a battle. But it was a battle worth fighting. He had not only built a successful business, he had transformed an entire community. Inside the bank's conference room, James gathered with his leadership team to discuss the next steps for the bank's future. The energy in the room was palpable. They talked about expanding the bank's services to neighboring towns, increasing their support for minority-owned businesses, and launching a new digital banking platform that would make their services more accessible to people across the country. The possibilities were endless, and James felt excited for what lay ahead. But as they discussed the future, James couldn't help but think about the past, the struggles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way: Angela, who had stood by him through every challenge; Marcus, who had believed in his vision from the start; Mr. Thompson, who had guided him through the complexities of the banking industry. Without them, none of this would have been possible. And then there was the community, the people who had trusted him, who had chosen to bank with him, who had supported him even when the larger institutions had tried to take him down. They were the real heroes of this story. They had proven that when a community stands together, nothing is impossible. Later that afternoon, James stood in front of a crowd of customers, employees, and community leaders at an event to celebrate the bank's anniversary. He looked out at the faces of the people he had worked so hard to serve, and a deep sense of gratitude filled his heart. "I stand here today not because of what I've accomplished," James began, his voice strong and steady, "but because of what we've accomplished together. This bank is a testament to the power of community, to the strength of our collective will to overcome obstacles, and to the belief that everyone deserves a chance to succeed." The crowd applauded, and James paused for a moment, taking it all in. He thought about the future, about the next generation of leaders, entrepreneurs, and community members who would take the foundation he had built and make it even stronger. "This is not just a celebration of the past 5 years," James continued. "This is a celebration of what's to come. The work we're doing here is bigger than any one of us. It's about creating a future where everyone, no matter where they come from or what they look like, has a fair shot at success." As the crowd cheered, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had turned his rejection into a triumph, his struggle into a legacy. Carter Community Bank was more than just a bank. It was a movement, a symbol of hope, resilience, and change. And James knew, as he looked out at the crowd, that the legacy he had built would last for generations to come. From rejection to redemption, James Carter's journey wasn't just about buying a bank. It was about changing the system that tried to shut him out. Carter Community Bank became more than just a financial institution. It became a symbol of what can be achieved when someone refuses to give up. James didn't just transform his life, he transformed his community, proving that with perseverance, integrity, and vision, even the biggest barriers can be broken down. His legacy now stands as a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of resilience.